Don't worry if you don't understand English very well. You can simply press the settings button and easily set a subtitle language.
For automatic subtitles, tap the CC icon or the settings button, select subtitles, and then the language you prefer. Works the same on all devices.
That was all super simple and quick. Enjoy watching.
Just say the name, Moses. What comes to mind? For most of us, it's these epic images, right? Parting seas, stone tablets, this incredible journey to freedom. We're talking about a figure who is just foundational to three of the world's biggest religions, and honestly, a timeless symbol of liberation.
I mean, it's really hard to overstate his influence, seriously. In Judaism, he's known as Moshe Rabbeinu. That means Moses, our teacher. He's considered the greatest prophet of all. For Christians and Muslims, he's this absolutely pivotal messenger from God. And, it goes way beyond just religion. His story, it's been a rallying cry for liberation movements for centuries. We're talking the American Revolution, the civil rights struggle. It's just massive.
And that right there is the big question we're going to tackle. Because behind that epic story, there's this really deep historical mystery. Is the Moses we know from faith the same person as the Moses of history? Or is there another story hiding just beneath the surface? So let's dive in and investigate.
All right, so first things first, we got to start with the baseline, right? The powerful, traditional story that's been told for thousands of years. This is the one most of us know, and it's going to be the starting point for everything we look at today. And wow, what a life story it is. Think about it. He starts as a prince in Egypt, living this life of luxury, but hiding a huge secret. Then, boom, he's in exile, a fugitive, learning what it means to be humble as a simple shepherd. And then, the dramatic return. He's a prophet now, facing down the most powerful ruler on the planet and becoming the architect of a whole new nation. It's an absolutely incredible journey. But, and this is the big question, can we actually find any trace of this in the historical record? Okay, so now we're going to shift gears. We're moving away from the story of faith and putting on our detective hats for some historical inquiry. For centuries, scholars have been trying to pin this story down to a real time and place. And their whole investigation kicks off with one huge question: when could the Exodus have actually happened? Now, I gotta be upfront. There's no single, aha, here it is, piece of proof. No smoking gun. But if you look at the bulk of the evidence, we're talking archaeology, ancient texts, all of it, most of it points to one specific period in history, the Late Bronze Age, somewhere around the 13th century BCE. So you can see here how the detective work really happens. On the one hand, you have an earlier date, around 1440 BCE. That comes from taking a single Bible verse literally. But on the other hand, you've got this later date, around 1290 BCE, which, well, it just seems to line up with a lot more outside evidence. For example, we know that the Pharaoh back then, the famous Ramses II, was a huge builder, especially in the Nile Delta, which is exactly where the story says the Israelites were working. On top of that, archaeology shows that some of the kingdoms they supposedly passed, like Edom and Moab, really weren't established states until that later period. All of this makes Ramses the most likely candidate for the Pharaoh of the Exodus.
But what if we're looking in the wrong century altogether? There's this other theory out there, a really fascinating and pretty radical one that challenges everything we've just talked about. And it all comes down to the most basic clue there is, his name. The name Moses itself. Yeah, the study of where names come from, it's called etymology. It's kind of like linguistic archaeology. You can dig up all sorts of clues about where and when a story got started just from a name. And let me tell you, the name Moses is one heck of a puzzle.
So here's the deal. Neither of the usual explanations for his name really fits perfectly. The one in the Bible says his name means drawn out of the water, but the grammar is a little off. It's actually in the active tense, like the one who draws out, not the one who was drawn out. Plus, you gotta ask, why would an Egyptian princess give a baby a Hebrew name? Seems a bit odd, right? So for a long time, most scholars leaned toward an Egyptian origin. They linked it to that common suffix you see in Pharaoh's names, like Thutmose or Amos, which means is born. And that seemed to point to a real, authentic 13th century Egyptian setting.
And here is where the plot twist comes in, and it's a big one. Recent work by Egyptologists has shown that way back in the 13th century BCE, that Egyptian word Mose wouldn't have sounded anything like the Hebrew Moshe. The vowels are just all wrong. It would have been pronounced more like Masa.
For it to actually sound like Moshe, you have to jump way, way forward in time, like deep into the first millennium BCE.
So this whole linguistic puzzle has led some scholars to a pretty radical new idea. People like Dr. Aaron Adair are suggesting, hey, maybe Moses wasn't part of the original Exodus story at all. Instead, they think he might have started out as an Egyptian folk hero from a much later time, the Hellenistic period. That's the era of Greek influence after Alexander the Great, around the 3rd century BCE. The theory is that this folk hero was then woven into the much, much older Israelite story about liberation. Okay, so this historical debate it's fascinating stuff, for sure. But it's also really important to remember that for billions of people, the power of the Moses story has never, ever depended on finding archaeological proof. Maybe his true identity isn't found in a history book, but in what his story means.
And you can see just how many layers there are to his legacy. He is the ultimate symbol of liberation from oppression. He's the lawgiver who creates a moral blueprint for civilization out of chaos. He's the great prophet, Moshe Rabbeinu, our teacher, who could speak directly with the divine. He's also this incredible model of leadership, someone who wasn't perfect, but who was defined by humility and just pure perseverance. And in some traditions, he's even seen as a kind of shadow, a forerunner pointing toward a perfect leader yet to come. So after all this detective work, after looking at the traditional story, the historical debates, the linguistic puzzles, where do we actually land? Well, we're not left with one clear photograph. It's more like we have several different portraits of Moses, each one telling a different part of the story.
I mean, we've basically laid out 4 different ways to answer that big question. Who was Moses? Is he the prophet from the traditional story, the Hebrew prince who became a nation builder? Is he a plausible, if maybe a little shadowy, historical leader from the time of Ramses? Is he a much later import, an Egyptian folk hero absorbed into the Exodus story? Or is he a timeless symbol, a figure whose meaning is just so much bigger than history?
So, was he a man of history? A real person we can try to find, however faintly, in the sands of time? Or was he more of a myth for a nation? You know, a foundational story created to give a people a shared identity and sense of purpose? Or maybe has he become something even bigger? A symbol for all of humanity, a story of fighting for freedom that belongs to every single one of us. And that really leads us to the final, biggest question of all, doesn't it? Because whether he was a man, a myth, or some combination of the two, there's just no denying that the story of Moses has profoundly shaped our world. Which really makes you stop and think, does a story have to be historically factual to be true?
If you like the story of Moise and want to discover other personalities, press the like button, subscribe, and share. See you in the next episode.